Okay, hello again everybody, and welcome to the second of our recordings about the Cold War. I hope everyone out there is doing really well. I hope that if you've got any questions about any of the recordings so far, or any of the PowerPoints on Blackboard or anything, that you make sure that you let me know so that I can get you answers and help clear up any confusion or uncertainty there. When we talked in our last recording, we were looking at the emergence of the Cold War, right, in the really weeks and months immediately following the end of World War II in Europe. Tension starts to grow between the Soviet Union and sort of a loose conglomeration of nations in what we would call the West, primarily the United States and Great Britain. And certainly the United States in the post-war years is really going to take the lead in being the sort of counterweight, I guess, to Soviet power in Europe and increasingly then internationally, globally. So that recording talked about the emergence of the Cold War, talked about containment theory and some different examples of containment theory and sort of adjustments or tweaks of containment over time. And we finished up with the war in Korea, which was really the first time when the Cold War flares up into actual warfare. Fortunately, the Cold War never ends up being a direct confrontation between the United States and the Soviet Union, because especially with the sort of growing nuclear arsenals that those countries have, it would have been practically global annihilation if that would ever come about. So it's important to keep in mind, though, that the Cold War is a very wide-ranging kind of an experience. So it definitely includes those sorts of foreign affairs, things that are happening in other countries that the United States and the Soviet Union primarily are kind of manipulating or involved with. But there is also very much an internal kind of an issue that centers around the Cold War, right? Domestic kinds of affairs. And so that's really going to be the primary focus of this particular recording, talking about some of the impact that the Cold War has on American society and American politics inside its own borders. Obviously, there's way more to it than we're getting into here. It's a really fascinating subject. If you've got questions, if you're curious about more about the Cold War, please let me know, because it's a really interesting kind of topic in a lot of ways, especially in the way that it gets reflected in popular culture and films and music and that kind of thing. So make sure that you let me know. We just don't have time to get into it here, unfortunately. So there is a period in the 1940s and into the 1950s that's known as the Second Red Scare. A lot of times it gets maybe kind of erroneously described as just the Red Scare, but in reality there had been an earlier period in American history, right at the end of the 19-teens and the very early 1920s, that historically is considered the first Red Scare. So this is really kicking off in the late 40s and especially into the 1950s, because there are a number of different developments that happen, especially in American politics, that really contribute to this widespread paranoia among millions and millions of Americans that the Soviet Union is no longer just an external threat, but that they have spies and saboteurs and subversives living in the United States who are working in one way or another to undermine American society or to undermine American politics, to brainwash the American people into being, godless communists or whatever the case may be. And so there are these various attempts, some of which are maybe well-meaning, but oftentimes not even that so much, to try to root out the assumed or imagined presence of communist subversives and what is known increasingly as the fifth column, right? This sort of invisible group of people that is out there just waiting to engage in some kind of action to topple the American government and to topple the American capitalist society. So you have an organization that is a committee of the House of Representatives called the House Committee on Un-American Activities, or HUAC. HUAC's most famous actions deal with investigations of Hollywood. And the reality is that during the 1930s especially, there were a number of figures in Hollywood, some of them actors, but lots of them producers or screenwriters or directors, who did start to affiliate with the Communist Party. And this was mainly because the Communist Party was avowedly anti-fascist and anti-Hitler. At the time, the American foreign policy was really stuck in isolation, and didn't want to get involved and didn't want to speak out vocally against Hitler and Hitler's regime. And the Communist Party globally and inside the United States was really one of the only political organizations that positioned itself very clearly being against Hitler. And so lots of Hollywood figures decided to gravitate towards that primarily for that reason, but that affiliation, that connection, ends up counting against them then by the turn of the situation after World War II, when now all of a sudden Hitler has been defeated and now the Soviets are the bad guys. So HUAC investigates what they perceive to be influence in the entertainment industry. In some cases, it's as much a mudslinging campaign, a witch hunt, as it is anything else, right? You're trying to find evidence, and so in some cases you find evidence that isn't very strong or that is circumstantial, or you find evidence that people were legally affiliated with a political party that was active, but there's nothing illegal or anything about that. And yet there are instances where people end up being jailed because of refusing to testify. There are fairly flimsy kinds of imprisonments based on perjury issues and that kind of thing. And so this is one of the first shots in what's known as the Second Red Scare. A little while later, there is an investigation by the US Senate that focuses in a different direction. They're looking at workers in sort of union leadership or education or diplomats, right? Again, trying to root out what they believe to be this invisible but very, very dangerous, very threatening kind of group of insurgents that are just waiting for their opportunity to overturn American capitalist democracy. There are instances where there are legitimate kinds of examples of espionage. Some of them get much more traction and much more coverage in the national media than others. Probably the most famous would be the trial of a husband and wife, Julius and Ethel Rosenberg, who were tried in 1951 and ultimately executed then in 1953. They were accused of sort of passing along secrets to the Soviets. The case against Julius is kind of flimsy. The case against Ethel is a little bit stronger. And so she almost certainly was involved. How much he knew or was active in this, hard to say. Probably the most infamous of the investigations and sort of attacks that come out of the Second Red Scare have to do with a senator from Wisconsin named Joseph McCarthy. And McCarthy ends up making a lot of sort of political hay out of the idea that the US government in particular is infested with communists. He's a fairly minor figure politically, up until the point in early 1950 when he makes this speech. And in his speech, he says, he holds up this piece of paper and he says, I've got 250 or 205 or 210, because the number of his list changes from one speech to another. I have this list of names of communists who are currently working in the State Department. And so he begins these hearings designed to expose these communists and to find out their connections and their friendships and their associations and acquaintances, to try to pull out all of the different communists that are employed as part of the US government. He continues to make these totally unsubstantiated charges, right? Provides no actual proof. And as I said, the number of people that he says he has on this list is constantly changing. And while very, very few people end up being imprisoned or charged with any kind of actual crime, the damage here is more in the consequence of people that their careers are ruined, their reputations are ruined. It gives him a great deal of influence over the kind of national conversation about the possibility or potential reality of communists operating inside the United States. And so what you start to see in both the HUAC hearings and the McCarthy hearings is people that start to get sort of stained by this reputation of being connected with communism, whether they had any affiliation with the Communist Party or not. Just the very sort of the taint of this kind of accusation, the stigma of this kind of accusation, ends up ruining careers and ruining lives, even if there's nothing that actually happened here. In 1954, McCarthy decides that he's going to take on the US Army, right? The momentum of his hearings and things is starting to wane, and he decides he needs to shoot for a bigger target, basically. And so he attacks the Army. And in these televised hearings, he starts going after fairly prominent figures in the upper echelons of Army leadership. And it becomes fairly obvious to the American public. This is the first time they can actually see what McCarthy is doing firsthand. And the American public recognizes that this guy is a demagogue, right? He's a blowhard. He's making these totally unsupported claims. He's just trying to badger witnesses and sort of verbally bludgeon them into submission. And he's running up against now witnesses and defendants who are in some ways more capable and in other ways more successful at defending themselves, right? And so these hearings reveal him to be basically a fraud and virtually obliterate any public support. And finally, the US Senate ends up censuring him and saying, look, you're operating and you're behaving in ways that don't reflect the best qualities of a US senator. And he ends up then losing virtually all of his influence and sort of political power. And a few years later, he's dead, potentially from sort of uncontrolled alcoholism. But what he represents here is very much a powerful kind of paranoia, a powerful kind of fear that is going to last throughout the Cold War. Certainly there will be times during the Cold War when it's going to be more prominent or more significant in the American public than others. But it is a very deep-seated fear, even today, right? Politicians constantly trot out the accusation of being socialist or being communist as a way of sort of fear-mongering, right? To misrepresent the actual beliefs and actual arguments of political opponents in such a way that it's going to scare voters into thinking, wow, I can't vote for so-and-so because he's a socialist, when that's not the case. But it is a very powerful kind of boogeyman that can be trotted out on a regular basis to, in a sense, kind of intimidate or frighten voters, or frighten the public in general in one direction or another. And so certainly the Cold War is a moment when this is going to be much more prominent, but that's not to say that those kinds of assertions don't exist as part of the national debate even today. So you have this internal and external sort of affair or involvement with the Cold War. And in some cases, those kind of overlap, right? So containment is a very expensive proposition, because what you have to do is you need to maintain a very active and very ready and very updated military scattered around the planet in order to effectively restrict the Soviet Union from growing. And so this is going to lead to the emergence of what President Eisenhower will call the military-industrial complex, right? This is basically a growing industry within the American economy that's designed to continue producing the weapons and powering the US military at a very high level, and takes huge amounts of public expenditure, right? Even today, the United States spends more on its military than certainly any other nation in the world, and in some ways, more than several nations combined. And it's really an outgrowth of the sort of global approach, excuse me, the global approach that grows from the Cold War. There is also a growing emphasis on a doctrine of sort of containment that's known as massive retaliation. Massive retaliation says we should build enough nuclear weapons, and powerful enough nuclear weapons, that no nation would dare attack the United States, especially looking at you, Soviet Union. No nation would dare attack the United States because they are perfectly aware that they would face absolute annihilation as a consequence, right? Build enough weapons that the potential result, the potential consequence of any attack against the United States would be complete obliteration. And so this is really the doctrine that is emphasized in developing the nuclear arsenal in particular. But it is increasingly kind of recognized as an effective deterrent, even all the way down to conventional weapons, right? Regular bombs and bullets and tanks and airplanes and people, right? But containment, the Cold War, it really starts to kind of tweak the American mindset so that from the president all the way down, people begin to view virtually every nationalist movement or independence movement of the 1950s and 60s and 70s and 80s, all through the lens of communism, right? So a group of people in Latin America or a group of people in Africa might be trying to get their independence, and regardless whether they are actually connected with communists or the Soviet Union in reality, the perception is, wow, this is another effort by the communists to try to take over a country. So it clouds the perspective of American diplomats and American politicians and the American public for a long, long time. One of the incidents that really brings the Cold War to sort of down to earth, sort of no pun intended or no irony intended, for a lot of Americans is the launching of the first satellite in space. And this is done by Russia. And the Americans become aware of this in October of 1957. And this is a shock, right? Because Americans had been convinced that technologically speaking, the United States was far beyond the Russians, that it was, that the United States was kind of safe and comfortable and snuggled up in its technological superiority. And now all of a sudden, the Soviets have managed to put this thing into space. Now, Sputnik is just a little bit larger than a basketball, right? It is tiny, tiny compared to the International Space Station or things that we've got in orbit today. But the fear, the immediate kind of reaction is, well, if the Soviets could put that into space, what's to stop them from putting a missile into space that could somehow land on America? What's to stop them from putting a weapon into orbit that could somehow attack the United States that we wouldn't be able to defend against, right? We can't send fighter jets against it. We can't send, we can't shoot it down. We can't do any of these things. And so the satellite itself is not the threat or the fear. The fact that they have the technology to put something into orbit, or that they have the technology to launch missiles that can reach that kind of altitude, that could potentially reach that altitude and then rain devastation down on the United States as part of its trajectory, as part of its path, those are the concerns. So Eisenhower and Congress rushed through this National Defense Education Act to really emphasize science and mathematics in especially college and postgraduate education, but also changing the kinds of requirements at the secondary and primary or grammar school level too, right? Because they say, well, this is a danger, this is a threat to America's technological, intellectual, innovative superiority that needs to be addressed. And that question of the danger of missiles now in the Cold War is really emphasized with probably the most famous incident in the Cold War, which is the Cuban Missile Crisis. Basically, the Cuban Missile Crisis is a period of about 2 weeks in mid to late October 1962 that comes from American reconnaissance flights that are flying over Cuba. And as they're taking pictures of what's on the ground, they notice that there seem to be these missile sites that are being built in Cuba. Now, Cuba is only 90 miles away from Florida. If these missiles would go into effect, right, if they would be activated, you can see the map on the lower left, they could potentially reach millions and millions of Americans, whether it's people living in New York City or Washington, D.C., or Cleveland, Ohio, or Chicago, or Atlanta, or potentially even as far away as Denver. Excuse me. And so the Americans are in this quandary, right? They know that the Russians are doing this. They present this evidence at the United Nations, and they challenge the Russians to, remove these missiles because it's a very provocative kind of a thing. But the problem is, if the Russians choose not to do that, then the ball is in the Americans' court. And if the United States were to decide to invade Cuba to destroy these missile sites, this would lead to war, guaranteed. Now, the thing that's working in President Kennedy's favor is none of these sites are actually active yet. So in some cases, the launching facilities are there, but the missiles aren't. In some cases, missiles are there, but warheads aren't, or fuel isn't. And so what Kennedy decides to do is to blockade Cuba, right? He sends the US Navy and he says, we're going to circle Cuba and prevent Russian ships from delivering the stuff that's necessary to actually make these missiles functional. Well, technically speaking, a blockade like this is an act of war. Fortunately, neither side is willing to escalate the situation all the way to the level of outright nuclear war. So as the Navy is blockading Cuba, Kennedy is working feverishly behind the scenes with the Soviet premier, a guy named Nikita Khrushchev, to try to sort of lessen some of these tensions, lessen some of this crisis. Eventually, those negotiations and the the clear lack of enthusiasm for World War III on both sides, at least at the very leadership of both sides, because it turns out there are generals who are really gung-ho about the idea of taking the planet into World War III at the time. But calmer heads prevail, fortunately. The Soviets end up removing the missiles and the launching facilities from Cuba. The United States says, as long as you guarantee to do that, we will not invade Cuba. We will not work anymore to try to eliminate Castro's communist government in Cuba. And we will remove missiles that we have that are threatening the Russians from Turkey. So the United States, sort of secretly to some extent, had constructed very provocative missiles in Cuba, or in Turkey rather, that from the Russian perspective were very similar to what the Russians were putting into Cuba that threatened the United States. So the Americans say, well, sort of tit for tat here, right? If you take the missiles out of Cuba, we will take our missiles out of Turkey, and we can all kind of rest easier as a result. And so fortunately, as tense and as dangerous as the missile crisis was, that was potentially one of the closest moments that the world came to an outright nuclear war between the major powers. And so when we get into the next recording, we'll talk about this brief period during the 1970s when Cold War tensions sort of lessen. But by the 1980s, with the election of Ronald Reagan, with the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan, different things are happening globally by the 1980s that ramp up those tensions very dramatically once again. And so that's going to be where we'll wrap up and talk about then what happens in the 1980s, how that contributes to ultimately the collapse of communist governments throughout Eastern Europe, including the communist government of Russia. And so that's going to be where we'll get next. So let me know if you've got questions. Make sure you're looking at all of the full PowerPoints in addition to the recordings, and I will see everybody shortly.